How do you build the biggest Ponzi scheme in history while making people feel secure? You don't promise spectacular returns. You don't chase headlines. You do the opposite. You speak quietly. You turn people away. You offer steady 10 to 12% gains and make getting in feel like a privilege. For nearly 2 decades, Bernie Madoff didn't sell greed. He sold safety. And $65 billion in fabricated wealth survived not because no one looked, but because everything about the man made looking feel unnecessary. Bernie Madoff's reputation did the heavy lifting. In the world of high finance, he was more than just another hedge fund manager. He was a former chairman of NASDAQ, a fixture at industry conferences, a man whose name opened doors on Wall Street. His office, perched high in the lipstick building, was all muted colors and polished surfaces, designed to feel both exclusive and unremarkable. The message was clear. This was not a place for drama, but for discipline. Madoff's personal style spoke the same language. Navy suits, understated ties, a calm, almost paternal manner. He didn't need to pitch himself. The mere fact of his presence, the quiet confidence, suggested he belonged to the inner circle of financial power. For investors, that was the first sign of safety. Not just anyone could get in. Access was by referral or invitation, often through the right clubs, dinners, or philanthropic boards. Feeder funds and private banks whispered about limited capacity and stringent suitability standards. The more exclusive it seemed, the more people wanted in. The returns he offered were never wild. 10 to 15% a year, steady as the tide, with no sharp spikes or sudden drops. The numbers looked boring, almost too boring. But in a world shaken by market crashes and sudden losses, that kind of predictability felt like a lifeline. Madoff didn't promise fortune. He promised calm. That promise drew in the powerful and the cautious alike. Wealthy families, charities managing endowments, university foundations, even banks. They saw his track record, his regulatory credentials, and the company he kept. They saw other respected names already inside. Trust became contagious. The architecture of belief was built from the outside in, brick by brick, with status, polish, institutional familiarity, and the quiet thrill of being chosen. It worked because it didn't look like a sales pitch. It looked like the safest room in the building. Bernie Madoff's operation ran on a story that was as carefully engineered as any investment product on Wall Street. He told clients he used a split-strike conversion strategy, something that sounded technical, but in plain English meant he supposedly bought stocks from the S&P 100, then hedged the risk by buying and selling options. The idea was to make modest gains in good times and lose little in bad. On paper, it looked like a way to smooth out the chaos of the markets. But the real engine was pure fiction. There were no trades. There was no hedging. Instead, every month, Madoff's team in the back office printed out statements that showed steady, reassuring profits. The numbers never spiked, never crashed, never even wobbled. Investors received glossy reports showing their accounts growing by the same gentle slope year after year, as if market storms never touched them. The returns were always just right, Not greedy, not flashy, but safe and consistent. The paperwork that backed up this illusion was a masterpiece of forgery. Trade confirmations, account statements, and even the daily records of supposed buying and selling were created after the fact, sometimes months later, tailored to fit whatever the market had already done. When clients asked for proof, they got stacks of documents that seemed to match the real market's movements, but only in hindsight. The entire process was designed to look boring, regulated, and routine. Exactly what cautious investors wanted to see. Frank DePascali, Madoff's longtime lieutenant, managed the day-to-day theater. He oversaw the fake trades, coordinated the flow of new money, and made sure the statements always reflected the calm, predictable gains that kept clients at ease. It was DePascali who kept the machinery running, making sure every detail lined up with the story of safety and expertise. Outside scrutiny was nearly non-existent. The firm's auditor, Freeling and Horowitz, was a tiny operation, just a single accountant in a suburban office, who never actually checked the trades or the balances. No independent verification, no real oversight. The illusion held because it was never seriously challenged. Underneath it all, the fraud was brutally simple. New money came in from fresh investors and was used to pay withdrawals and the promised returns to earlier clients. As long as more cash flowed in than went out, the scheme stayed afloat. It was not market genius at work, but a basic cash flow trick, one that depended entirely on trust, reputation, and the appearance of unwavering stability. Warnings about Bernie Madoff's operation didn't just exist. They echoed for years in the halls of regulatory power, only to be muffled by the weight of his reputation. Harry Markopoulos, a quiet but relentless financial analyst, sent detailed reports to the Securities and Exchange Commission as early as 2000, laying out the mathematical impossibility of Madoff's returns. He showed how the numbers didn't add up, how the supposed trades couldn't be real, how the strategy was a mirage. His memos were precise, urgent, and impossible to ignore if anyone had wanted to listen. But the system didn't want a scandal. Madoff's name was carved into the upper echelons of Wall Street. He had served as chairman of NASDAQ, sat on industry panels, and moved easily among regulators and bankers. To question him was to question the judgment of everyone who had ever vouched for him. Inside the Securities and Exchange Commission, Markopoulos's warnings were passed from desk to desk, sometimes lost, sometimes quietly dismissed. No one wanted to be the person who accused a financial legend of fraud without irrefutable proof. The risk wasn't just being wrong, it was being ostracized, ridiculed, or worse, responsible for a false alarm that could shake the markets. Madoff's aura of respectability created a kind of institutional blindness. Feeder funds, private banks, and even government investigators assumed that someone else had already done the hard work of verification. The steady returns, the polished office, the familiar face at industry events, all of it made the idea of fraud seem not just unlikely, but almost unthinkable. It wasn't the absence of red flags that kept the scheme alive. It was the absence of anyone willing to look directly at them and say out loud what they saw. Smoothness is seductive. In the world of investing, volatility is a warning sign. Wild swings and sudden drops set off alarms. But when the numbers glide upward month after month, doubt goes quiet. That is the power of consistency. It settles nerves, mutes skepticism, and makes the improbable feel safe. In Madoff's case, the calm was the product. He did not offer the rush of a hot stock tip or the gamble of high-octane trades. Instead, he sold the feeling that nothing bad could happen here. Most people do not want to chase the next big thing. They want to sleep at night. They want to see statements that never shock, only reassure. The absence of drama becomes its own sales pitch. Each steady report, each gentle gain is a subtle promise that someone is in control. Someone who knows the rules, who has seen the storms and steered through them. The brain reads that kind of predictability as competence, as mastery. Doubt fades, replaced by relief. This is how emotional comfort replaces due diligence. When the numbers never wobble, when every quarter looks like the last, the urge to ask hard questions slips away. Investors start to believe that risk is something you can opt out of, as if uncertainty is a flaw that can be engineered away. The truth is harsher. The very smoothness that feels so safe can be the most dangerous sign of all. Certainty, when it is packaged and sold, is often just another product. One that people buy, not with logic, but with hope. In Madoff's world, the quiet was the hook. It was the steady hush that told people over and over that they were in the safest room in finance. That is how trust is built, not always through proof, but through the promise of calm. By December 2008, the math stopped working. For years, new money had always outpaced withdrawals. But as the financial crisis deepened, investors across the world rushed to pull their funds. Redemption requests soared past $7 billion, more than Madoff's operation could ever cover. The cash simply wasn't there. On December 10th, inside his Manhattan apartment, Bernie Madoff called his sons, Mark and Andrew, into the room. He told them, flat and final, that the investment advisory business was finished. He said, "It's all just one big lie." He admitted there were no investments, no trades, just a giant Ponzi scheme, and nothing left to pay out. That moment snapped the story from theory to confession. The sons sat in silence, then called their lawyer. They knew what had to happen next. That night, Mark and Andrew reported their father to federal authorities. By morning, FBI agents arrived at the apartment. Madoff answered the door in a bathrobe, already resigned. He was taken into custody and charged with securities fraud. The number he gave for the losses, at least $50 billion, would echo through every courtroom and headline. Inside the firm, Frank DePascali, Madoff's closest lieutenant, wrote 2 words in his diary: Madoff implodes. DePascali later recalled seeing Madoff crying, saying he was at the end of his rope with no more money to give. The illusion of safety built over decades, collapsed in a single day. The secret was out, and nothing would be the same. The numbers are almost too big to hold in the mind. $17.5 billion in vanished principal, $64.8 billion in phantom profits that never existed outside of forged statements. But the true damage of Bernie Madoff's fraud was measured in lives derailed, institutions gutted, and a kind of trust that may never fully return. Charities that once funded cancer research, scholarships, and food banks saw their endowments erased overnight. Some closed their doors for good. Retirement plans built over decades evaporated in a matter of days, leaving families to face the future with nothing but regret and disbelief. Multi-generational fortunes, carefully managed, handed down, diversified, were wiped out by a single line on a fraudulent account statement. The losses were not just numbers on a spreadsheet. They were broken promises, a daughter's college fund, a hospital wing that would never be built, a pensioner's last hope for security. For many, the pain was compounded by shame. How could they have been fooled? How could the system have failed so completely? The devastation ran through every layer of society, from small-town nonprofits to storied family foundations and global banks. No one was immune. Even after the collapse, the full scale of the damage kept unfolding. Some victims never recovered, financially or emotionally. Others spent years in court, fighting for a fraction of what they had lost. The process of clawing back funds, painful and public, pitted former friends and business partners against each other, deepening the wounds. Yet the greatest casualty was invisible. What vanished was the sense that the system itself could be trusted. If a man with Madoff's credentials, his standing, and his reputation could run the largest fraud in history for decades, what does safety mean? The idea that calm, consistency, and prestige could be relied upon, that comfort itself could be purchased, was shattered. In the end, trust was not just collateral damage, it was the main event. On March 10th, 2009, federal prosecutors filed criminal charges against Bernard Madoff, 11 felony counts, including securities fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, and perjury. In court, Madoff stood before the judge and pleaded guilty to every charge. He admitted, in his own words, that it was all fake. There were no investments, no trades, just a giant Ponzi scheme. The judge handed down a sentence of 150 years in prison, a term so long it erased any hope of freedom. With that, the man who once embodied Wall Street respectability became the face of the largest financial fraud in history. But the story did not end with a verdict. The collapse set off a legal reckoning that would stretch for years. Irving Picard, appointed as trustee under the Securities Investor Protection Act, took on the task of untangling the wreckage. His job was to find and recover as much stolen principal as possible. Picard's team traced funds through a maze of shell accounts, feeder funds, and international transfers. They filed lawsuits against banks, hedge funds, and individuals who had withdrawn more than they invested, clawing back billions for victims. The numbers told their own story. $17.5 billion in principal vanished. $64.8 billion in phantom profits never existed outside of forged statements. By 2026, Picard had recovered over $15 billion, the result of relentless litigation and settlements. But for many, restitution was slow, partial, and never enough to restore what was lost. The legal response became its own investigation, not just into crimes, but into the system that allowed them. Courtrooms filled with stories of ruined lives and broken trust. The process was methodical, not redemptive. There were no heroes, only the long, grinding work of accountability. The aftermath was not a return to safety, but a reminder that in finance, trust can be shattered in an instant, and certainty, once lost, is almost impossible to recover. The urge for certainty is as strong as ever. In today's markets, safety still comes wrapped in polished language and familiar rituals, quarterly letters, expert panels, the right address, the right handshake. Investment products promise not just growth, but comfort. Some offer algorithmic stability. Others lean on celebrity endorsements or the aura of exclusive access. The pitch always sounds the same. This time, the process is bulletproof. This time, the risk is managed away. But trust signals have never been easier to manufacture. A blue-chip logo, a slick app, a well-known spokesperson, these can substitute for real transparency. Gated access, waiting lists, and private invitations still convince people that selectivity equals quality. The old cues, calm voices, steady numbers, the quiet confidence of belonging carry as much weight now as they did in any wood-paneled office. The same psychology that drew investors to Madoff's door is alive in every corner of modern finance. The lesson is not buried in the past. Every time a fund, a platform, or an advisor offers the promise of smooth sailing, the question returns: are we buying performance? Or the feeling that someone else has already done the worrying for us? The architecture of belief is always under construction, brick by brick, out of social proof, status, and the deep human need to feel safe. The next scandal may look different, but the blueprint for trust remains stubbornly familiar. In the end, the story of safety for sale is not just about one man or one era. It's about what we're all still willing to believe. Even now, billions move on faith, often unchecked, and always vulnerable. In the shadows of every promise, the urge for certainty still blinds the wary and the wise. Madoff's legacy is not just loss, but a question. If safety can be forged, who decides what is real? In finance, trust remains the most valuable and dangerous asset. What do you trust and why? Share your thoughts below.